group of colonies we're going to discuss are these southern colonies. And the southern colonies are Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. And originally North and South Carolina were one colony, and then it broke in two. And these are the southern colonies. The Mason-Dixon line. You will hear this, you'll hear this, and you need to know this for later on, especially when we start talking about the Civil War. But this was a survey line that was made to find the boundary between Pennsylvania and Maryland. Maryland is considered a southern colony. And so it is really the dividing line, or the line that says, here's your middle colonies, here's your southern colonies. Virginia. Virginia had difficult, at the beginning, difficult living conditions. And remember we said that the amount of death in Jamestown was crazy because of disease and the poor place they settled. So there was a lot of problems with this colony getting established. By 1640 there were only 10,000 settlers. By 1670 there were 40. The Native American population shrank from disease and violence with the farmers who kept pushing away, pushing out, grabbing more land from Jamestown into the surrounding land. And farmers took over and they planted tobacco. And we already looked at the rise in tobacco production, which correlated with the rise of slavery in the United States. So at first, Virginia had a difficult time getting established as a colony. If you had money, you got the best land. Wealthy landowners bought the best land as they began to invest, as the Virginia company that established Jamestown began to make a profit. These wealthy investors began to come and buy a lot of land. The poorer colonists had no land for themselves. And this caused, they were like, we've come over here, we've traveled here, we're trying to get land, establish our own lives, and we can't. So they began to rebel, because without owning land, in Virginia, you could not vote. So owning land didn't just make you considered wealthy. It also gave you a voice in the government and how things would be done. Well, if you own land and you're voting, how are you going to vote? You're going to vote for the things that benefit you. And that's what made these younger settlers coming in so angry, because they knew that the cards were stacked against them. So poor farmers moved inland to develop farms, and because they couldn't get better land that was closer to the coast, and this angered the Native Americans. So now you got the young farmers angry, you got the Native Americans angry, nobody's happy. So tensions grew to the point where Nathaniel Bacon organized the frontier settlers who began to attack the Native Americans. They were like, hey, these guys, we can't vote. Native Americans are in our way. We're just going to if we don't have any control or anything, we're at least going to get rid of the Native Americans. So they began to attack the Native Americans so they could establish more farms. The governor of Virginia at that time says, leave the Native Americans alone. Stop rocking the boat. And so he declared Bacon a rebel. Bacon and his crew, they say, a rebel? I'll show you what a rebel is. And they actually come to Jamestown and burn it. They attack it and burn it. And the governor just kind of realized, I don't have any control. I don't have enough militia. I can't get people who really want to move west in Virginia who don't have access to land. I can't stop them from trying to move out there and pushing and taking the Native American lands. It was during this period with Bacon that a lot of the young men began to move south into what we know as North Carolina today, trying to find good farmland. So this is the early history of Virginia. Right under here, the Mason-Dixon line, you have the colony of Maryland. Now, George Cavaret, he was a Catholic. Now, he was not part of the Church of England. A Catholic, even though it's Christian, and Protestant, even though it's Christian, they're very different forms of Christianity. He was given a charter, and a charter is that legal permission by the king or the queen for a colony. So, because he was Catholic, he set Maryland up to be a safe place for Catholics, where they could have religious freedom, where there wouldn't be persecution. And so he passed the Act of Toleration and welcomed all Christians, and male Christians all had the right to vote. This was one of the few times, this in Pennsylvania, the idea of giving equality. The thing that makes Maryland so different is that they didn't have in Pennsylvania, that this Act of Toleration says even if you are not a Catholic, you will still be given the right to vote, a say in the government. And that was, again, the hinting of thinking our First Amendment, where we have freedom of religion. The beginning of religious freedom being part of the law. Not just will let you do it, but legally you have the right to do that. The Carolinas. As Virginia settlers moved south, King Charles granted a charter for a Carolina colony. We've already discussed this. The northern part, this part, which is North Carolina, developed very slowly. Poor harbors, lousy rivers, lots of reasons for it. The southern part down here, what we know as South Carolina today, had great farmland and grew quickly because it's much more of a tropical, subtropical climate where you can grow sugar and rice and indigo. So in South Carolina, due to the climate, they were able to grow wonderful crops, and North Carolina was kind of stuck in the middle. So South Carolina also had many more slaves. So the Carolinas, originally it was one big colony, and then it broke off. And South Carolina, originally before they broke off, one of our primary export was rice. That was still considered this exotic food. This food was not known here in Europe. So it was grown in Africa, and so planters imported it here. It was considered an exceptional food when they brought the slaves. And we had so many slaves brought over to work these labor-intensive crops that by 1710, black slaves were the majority. There were more slaves than there were white owners in South Carolina. So that tells you there were these huge farms, these plantations. Farming was the main method of income, and that slavery was predominant in keeping the economy and the lifestyle going. Then you have the Carolina splits. The northern part of Carolina colonies shared a border with Virginia. Virginia was dominated by rich planters who were members of the Church of England. Dissenters, or people in Virginia who did not agree with the Church of England, moved to northern Carolina. They were poor farmers. They didn't need slaves, very different than South Carolina. The traits of North Carolinians: they were very much non-religious. They were hospitable to pirates, scofflaws, people who pushed back, and they were very resistant to authority. Now, the division between, it got so difficult to manage this whole Carolina colony that by 1712, it was decided to divide it. So you have South Carolina and North Carolina, and North Carolina officially separated. Georgia. Georgia was founded for two reasons. First of all, Spain owned this land here. Georgia was founded as a buffer between these English colonies and this land owned by Spain. And so that was the main thing. We wanted a place where if we got to war with Spain again, that there would be a buffer. They would be right on top of our more populated, more profitable colonies. And then it was also founded by James Oglethorpe. And in England, there was the policy of if you owed money, and we'll see how much sense this makes. If you owed somebody money and you did not pay it back, you were arrested, tried, thrown in prison until you could pay the money back. Well, that's the oxymoron in it. How do you pay the money back when you're in prison and you can't work? So James Oglethorpe decided these people who are in debtor prison, these people who are not for a specific crime, but just because they owe money, he wanted to give them a place where they could establish a new beginning. They could start their own farm. They could work at the money to pay off the debt and then to live, in a sense, respectably. And so Georgia was founded for those two reasons, as a place of protection for debtors and a buffer between our colonies and Spain. Oglethorpe wanted Georgia to be small farms without slaves, so the debtors could have a place to start their lives over. He was a man who really cared about these people and understood hard times and understood that circumstances can get you in places you never intended to go. And so he wanted to offer them small farms and to kind of have a new lease on life. Southern colonies. Some of the basic characteristics: they had large plantations. They grew crops that promoted the use of slaves. They were very labor-intensive crops, and so you needed lots of workers. The South was basically divided between the very wealthy, large plantation owners and your poorer farmer. Those poorer farmers were basically what we call the backcountry, the Piedmont and the mountains. They lived in isolated farms, these shacks. They were poor. Then you have the large, wealthy, typically white landowners in the plantations towards the coast. The backcountry, the lifestyle was a sharp contrast to the wealthy landowners along the coast. So you have these two different cultures, these two different ways of living, and when you have that, who in this case do you think would really have more power? Think about that. Tell me tomorrow. And that also would cause a conflict. So basically, we quickly covered the New England colonies, the middle colonies, your southern colonies. These colonies are now established, and they are a major profit base for England. But now that they're established, what happens next? That'll be on our next video.